is actually our deficit, and not even the deficit as it stands right now. In Paper Soldiers is all empires think they're special and all empires fall. Federal shutdown, all of these things shake the confidence of investors and foreign countries in the US's ability to continue to lead. It has remained a bastion of democracy because part of being a democracy means that we will be very self-critical, and we've had these self-critical moments in the past, the Civil War, the Civil Rights moment.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Today I'm joined by Saleha Mohsin, who is a senior Washington correspondent for Bloomberg News, where she follows policy, politics, and power in Washington, D.C. Today she joins me to speak about her book, Paper Soldiers: How the Dollar Changed the World Order. Saleha, welcome to InferTalks.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Saleha, let's go ahead and start our conversation. And the very first question that I really want to ask you is basically about, starting from your very own book, and perhaps, if you could take us at the history of, the weaponization of the U.S. dollar itself. I really want to ask you, where does this history of using the U.S. dollar, or perhaps relying on the U.S. dollar, as a tool of foreign policy for using it as a tool of sanctions. Could you sort of walk us through when was there really a major shift to rely on the US dollar for that purposes? And when did we really see that intensification? Was it during the Cold War or was it after the Cold War? Could you help us, put things into perspective on that very question?
So thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be here with you in this virtual environment. In Paper Soldiers, I outline how the dollar became weaponized, and there's a couple of points in history that you can point to, and then there's the watershed moment. So the soft points are, I would say, I start the book in 1862 when the U.S. Civil War was going on. Salmon P. Chase, the Treasury Secretary at the time, realized that the Treasury Department had no money left. They needed to find a way to get some credit into the market. And so they created a paper currency. And it was a new thing, right? They looked at paper currency the way we think about CBDCs and cryptos right now, where it's this new thing. Is it going to work? Is it going to be long lasting? That was established. The next big point was in 1944, toward the end of World War II, when the economic policymakers of 44 countries around the world gathered in the U.S. and by design crowned the U.S. currency as King Dollar, that this is our anchor currency for global commerce and trade. At the time, it was pegged to gold, but it put the U.S. dollar at the center of the global financial system. Now, over the next several decades, a lot of things happened that basically increased the dollar's consolidation of power and status and centrality in the globe. But the real watershed moment that I would point to is 9/11. When 9/11 happened, I think one thing that people tend to forget is that President George W. Bush's war on terror did not start with a military tank rolling into a country. It started with the stroke of the pen on September 24th, 2001, when he gave the U.S. Treasury Department and the U.S. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill at the time unique authorities to use the dollar to track the financial dealings of known and alleged terrorists and organizations, and also to freeze those funds to stop them from having access to the dollar. And if you can't pay for an attack, then you can't carry out an attack. That was sort of the thinking. And that's where it started. And since then, we've seen the use of economic sanctions increase by almost 1,000% in the past 2.5 decades. And each sanction is a weaponization of the US dollar.
And so, Saleha, my next question would be, and perhaps the answers might be self-explanatory, but I want to hear it from you. Why did the US really, in the very first place, rely on using the US dollar, as a means to sanction other countries? And what did the US really gain in the process?
Economic sanctions are the space between words and war. So words are diplomatic relations. When you are in dialogue with a country trying to deter alleged bad activity. Now, in many scenarios in the past, often if words have not failed, have not worked, if they have failed, there was a sense of giving up, or if we're going to take this seriously, we're going to go straight to military action, kinetic action, sending American troops to the country, or their boots hit the ground in whatever territory they're dealing with. There is now a vast space between words and war, and that is economic sanctions to deter or contain malign activities around the world. And that's what the US has used. The dollar is at the center of the global financial system. Most transactions around the world, even if they're not with an American individual or company or entity, even if that transaction does not necessarily touch American jurisdiction or soil, it touches the US dollar. And so if a entity, a person, an oligarch of a government or a central bank is in any way seeing their access to the dollar restricted, that means they cannot engage in global commerce.
And so, Saleha, then the other question really becomes, what has really been the downside of relying on the US dollar itself for sanctions and for, coercing other countries or, say, other actors? I think critics might make a very useful argument that, it has kept countries like Iran from nuclear proliferation, or perhaps, say, for Russia, whose economy has really been dented after, it decided to invade Ukraine. What do you really think has been the downside, on the other hand, for the US dollar itself?
A lot of pros and cons to a weaponized dollar. A lot of it, whether it's a pro or a con for you, depends on where you sit. If you are the US or are allied with the US, then the pros would be that there has been more nuclear deterrence. The global financial system is as safe as it can be from corruption and bad actors, and the dollar and the financial system being weaponized by malign actors who are trying to disrupt global peace or global security, or the ability for the country or the world to remain knitted around the post-World War II economic integration and brotherhood, which is what the IMF, World Bank, G20, G7, all of these things kind of emerge from the ashes of these two world wars. The cons for the US and US allied countries would be that there are going to be limits to US dollar power. And the more sanctions are used, the more others are kind of forced to look for alternatives. And the more workarounds to the dollar there are, the less potent economic sanctions in the future are going to be. And on the flip side, if you are the target of economic sanctions, it's only a downside for you. If you look at Iran over the past few decades, their economy, oil is the lifeblood of that economy. Without access to the dollar, without access to the global financial system, they struggle to sell and trade their oil. If you look at Russia, it's hard to say. A lot of people talk about the efficacy of sanctions, especially in that case. It hasn't been looking great because the war is still going on 2 years later. But at the time, it was seen as a 3-day event. Kiev will fall in 3 days. That has not happened. Russia has been forced to sort of transform into a regular economy, into a war economy. At the same time, those sanctions are pretty porous. And so I think adversaries of the US and its allies are finding that there is a way to make things work without as much access to the dollar.
And so, Saleha, now on the other side, there are different kinds of sanctions. You've been actually working on it. You've written a book over, on the subject itself. On one hand, while we have actually targeted sanctions, then there are wide-ranging sanctions in the case of a country like Iran itself. What do you think really is perhaps the outcome on the population itself of such countries where you tend to have a wide-ranging set of sanctions? How do they sort of impact the perception of the people of that targeted country towards the foreign policy of the US itself. And I'm not specifically speaking about a country like Iran, but in general, if there were to be other countries in similar position, what have you really seen, as perhaps a downside when it comes to the perception about the US foreign policy itself?
Great question. And it's a complicated question with a complicated answer that can go in so many different directions. I think that for any other country, other people have seen, central banks and foreign governments have seen that exposure to the dollar means that they are beholden to American foreign policy. Sanctions allow the US to export its own foreign policy agenda and goals overseas. So it's a cudgel, right? If that's what it means to be a weapon. If another country decides to work out of alignment of US policy goals or geopolitical objectives, then they're subject to punishment. Now, a lot of countries are realizing this, are seeing this, and thinking, well, what if there is a coalition of countries that come together and work outside of the dollar? We're talking about BRICS and BRICS Plus, really, because the more countries are aligning with the BRICS in an effort that's kind of broadly called the de-dollarization effort. Should we create another currency to trade in so that we're not so exposed to the US and so beholden to US objectives? Because US domestic politics and policy is also looking less certain over the past, I would say, 8 years. And in fact, more. There has been a lot of division in Congress, in the electorate. We're also seeing volatility in our executive branch, in our presidency. In 2016, when one candidate won the popular vote and the other one won the electoral college, that is confusion about the strength and sort of righteousness of the democracy as well, because it's confusing that if more people chose one candidate, but the electoral college meant another candidate won, it's confusing what is the definition of democracy. And since then, there's been event after event. You can look at January 6th, the insurrection on Capitol Hill. You can look at all of the debt ceiling fights that we're seeing. You can look at the fact that we have two candidates in the US that are quite elderly. And what does that mean for the population and their ability to lead, and who might fill a gap if that happens? And so that this new landscape where there's uncertainty about where the US is at, and there is a confusion about what this much exposure to the dollar can mean and how US political volatility might affect its foreign policy agenda, then countries have come together to find a way to reduce their exposure. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 4 to 6 years, because a lot of times when there is a crisis somewhere, just last week we saw Iran and Israel tensions ratcheted up, and any small, medium, or large crisis of any kind, whether it's political instability in another country, a regional banking or economic crisis, volatility in the Middle East, you see investors looking for a safe haven. They want to park their cash in a place that is safe. And we saw just a week ago, investors fled to the US dollar. It is still, no matter what's been going on around the world, it is still seen as a safe and stable asset, because in a lot of ways, the US has remained a bastion of democracy, because part of being a democracy means that we will be very self-critical. And we've had these self-critical moments in the past, the Civil War, the Civil Rights movement, and countless other times, the Nixon administration. And as long as after this self-critical moment that plays out on a global stage at this point, everyone kind of sees us airing our dirty laundry out. As long as the US is able to emerge from that strong with a strong and stable democracy, then nothing can really impact the dollar or how it's viewed. Investors will still see it as a safe haven. The same foreign governments and central banks and entities that have talked about reducing dollar exposure are still using it and will probably still use it as a safe haven.
And Saleha, it's quite interesting that you make mention of the United States as a strong and a stable democracy. Yet at the same time, one of the very important questions that you've dealt with in your book is the question of a strong versus a weak dollar. And you've also discussed even different administrations trying to contemplate with that question, including the fact that President Trump came very close to contemplating that very decision, but at the end, he really balked at the very idea of going through it. Why is it that different U.S. administrations actually find it difficult to execute this decision in the very first place?
Touching on a really interesting part of the book. In Paper Soldiers, I outline that there are two definitions of a strong dollar. One definition is what we have just been talking about, the dollar's hegemony, its centrality globally, and how everyone needs the dollar. The world runs on dollar, therefore you need it. And if you see your access restricted, it can impact you. That's one kind of strength. The other kind of strength is just sheer foreign exchange rate value. Since the 90s, the U.S. has sought a strong economy. A strong economy usually denotes a stronger exchange rate like it does right now. And a strong exchange rate has underpinned globalization, which really took off mid-90s, early 2000s, a way for trade barriers to remain low, for American consumers, which drive the U.S. economy to actually turn and drive global growth and economic expansion. And so in order for foreign countries to sell more goods to the U.S., in order for American consumers and consumers here to have more stronger purchasing power, a stronger dollar has been sort of boosted by economic policymakers here, that we like a strong exchange rate because we can buy more goods that are made in China, made in Vietnam, made in Bangladesh. But the problem has been that folks kind of forgot about the negative effects of a strong dollar. That means that the U.S.'s own manufacturing sector, made in America goods, struggle to remain competitive in this kind of a global trade environment. And so that has caused a lot of internal domestic problems. That's why we're seeing the rise of populism. And so what you're referring to basically is the strong dollar policy, which in the book I outline was started by Bob Rubin. He sought to kind of calm the dialogue and mania around conversations about currency, because for a long time, governments did intervene in currencies. There were secret meetings in hotels in New York where, the G5 countries at the time, the five most advanced economies and powerful economies, came together to actively work together and devalue the dollar and control the dollar. Rubin kind of realized this is not working. It's not going to work for globalization. We need the dollar to always be judged and valued by the laws of supply and demand, free and fair open markets. So he kind of sought to calm that down. And that strong dollar mantra, where a Treasury Secretary only says one boring phrase, a strong dollar is in the best interest of the country, kind of calm things down. But we saw with President Trump that shifted. And that is actually really revelatory. I talk about that in the book, how you can listen to an administration or incoming officials' comments about currencies, and it will tell you how they feel about the ability to weaponize that currency, how they feel about trade, domestic and international economic policies. And we learned from Trump and his Treasury Secretary, Steven Mnuchin, that protectionism was on the rise. And it turns out it was here to stay. The Biden administration, it adopted those same policies, and it became a bipartisan policy that maybe a strong dollar is not necessarily good, strong meaning exchange rate power.
So, but on the other hand, when you see we are actually looking forward to an upcoming US presidential election season, and where you have a Republican candidate in form of Trump actually making or doubling down on his campaign promise of, going forward with that path of de-globalization and bringing back a lot of these manufacturing jobs back home. Uh, how do you think, or where do you think, a strong dollar sort of remains kind of like a stumbling block, or perhaps an obstacle towards realizing that campaign promise in reality or in actuality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In the best case scenario, the dollar is left alone and not really discussed very much because currency markets are just very different than they used to be in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s when governments tried to intervene. They were looking at a market that was like that, maybe $2 trillion of exchange rate trades happening in one day. Now it's $7 trillion worth of currency trades, sort of money changing hands each day. And so to actually forcibly intervene with words or just buying more dollars or selling dollars at markets from a government perspective won't have as much of an impact on the exchange rate. It could be disruptive in terms of sort of affecting the rules, the free and open rules of exchange rate markets. Really, the senior partner in U.S. currency policy is the Treasury Department, but it has when it comes to dollar exchange rate value, it has soft and sort of more long-term power. It's Treasury and then Congress that set economic policy, and so there's certain economic fiscal policies that will support a stronger dollar or a weaker dollar. The junior partner, which is the Federal Reserve, will rarely speak about the dollar. They like to defer to the Treasury Department, but it's their actions, monetary policy, and interest rate setting that will have the hard influence on the exchange rate. Like right now, the interest rate differential, you look at the Fed, our interest rates here are higher because central banks around the world are dealing with their own economic problems and inflation and things differently. They have lower interest rates. So that means the dollar is going to be by nature strong in terms of an exchange rate. And that's a more near-term, short-term power that they have. And so it's really hard for any one administration or official or country to control a currency that is as largely traded and influential as the US dollar.
A lead question that just comes to my mind, and I do understand that the probability of such a thing remains at this point, even in the short term, quite very low. But if President Trump were to sort of double down on his campaign promise of perhaps bringing those jobs back home and to tinker with the dollar, what kind of impact would that really have on the existing world order itself?
Yeah, the world is not used to an America that is so inward looking at domestic economic policy, more populist and protectionist trade policies, and that is sort of the current adjustment that's going on. Because there's a lot of questions about what is the U.S.'s global role? Is it still going to play a role in foreign policy and diplomacy, international economic diplomacy through G20 and G7 and IMF and World Bank? Um, I think any action by a future president to aggressively intervene unilaterally is going to be disruptive. I think the best way for the dollar to remain at the center of global trade and maintain its dollar hegemony and trustworthiness before investors is going to require a U.S. that leads multilaterally. So if you look at Russia sanctions, everyone says that they're US sanctions, but actually they're US-led sanctions. More than 30 countries came together. I think they represent roughly half of the world's GDP, came together to impose the sanctions on Russia 2 years ago in February 2022. So a US that moves unilaterally is going to be very disruptive to the global order.
And speaking about a very important question that's been quite like a hot topic these days, and this is the question of de-dollarization. Although you've sort of tackled it, in your conversation so far, but why do you really think other states or even multilateral forums like BRICS have even contemplated them in the very first place?
That's a great question. And this is a conversation that is raging in economic and financial circles in every capital of the world right now. I think, some people look to 9/11 as the point of rupture when the US, there was a coalition in the world that was sort of rising up against the US a little bit. The use of economic sanctions becoming so rampant, and if you look at Trump pulling out of the Iran deal, and how that was, again, it was unilateral. It was against what European allies wanted and what they were doing at the time. And so in the 20 teens, 2018, 19, we saw Europe trying to find a way to um, keep alive the Iran deal, its end of the Iran deal, without the U.S. And so they looked at ways to work around the dollar, continue to trade with Iran without violating U.S. sanctions. And a lot of work was done. They kind of went into the financial system, the plumbing system, to see what can we do, what new pipes can we create. A paper trail was created. And while that effort was not successful, because the U.S. kind of very sternly said, we will retaliate to this, against this, still the pipes were looked at, right? The groundwork, the blueprint is starting to be created. And we're seeing that happen now with U.S. Led sanctions on Russia, with countries thinking that if the U.S. could sanction the central bank of the world's 11th largest country at the time in 2022, Russia was number 11, a G20 country, could it be us? Especially when there's so much volatility in U.S. domestic politics and who is leading. Congress sometimes passes laws to push the Treasury Department to impose sanctions. The president sometimes pushes on those. And so if there's that kind of volatility, the minute countries are thinking, even allies of the U.S. are thinking, could it be us? You do have a problem. At the same time, I will say that I don't think any reserve asset by design needs to necessarily be as central and as powerful as the dollar has been over the last 80 years in the world. I think if there is a diversification in the world where there is more trade outside of the dollar, the US dollar is so deeply entrenched as the reserve asset that it would take many years and a lot for it to actually be replaced or removed as the world's reserve asset. It's almost like the English language as the world's lingua franca being replaced. Contracts are written in the English language. Contracts are denoted and settled in dollars, and it's very hard in today's sort of financial technology and how fast that's all moving to unwind all of that. So I think, and the other thing is that we'll see, when the global financial crisis happened, when we had a global health crisis, the dollar, the US Treasuries market was all seen as a safe haven. Even when the global financial crisis was an American-made problem, questions came up. Is the dollar too big now? Should the US have this power? Investors still had an insatiable appetite for US debt. And we haven't seen that change. So I think from the US perspective, the very US centric view would be, sure, go ahead and trade. We're here if you need me.
All right. And Saleha, you've tackled this question already in your book, but could you also sort of, for our audience's, insight and knowledge, also sort of walk them through what were some other attempts in the past as well to sort of, wean away from the dollar, although not really much came of those moves. But when did they really take place in the very recent history of the past decades?
Yeah, this idea of, is the dollar's reign about to end, or is there a new kid on the block? This happens constantly. Every 10 years, there's a new thing. In the 90s, there was talk about, maybe the Japanese yen could replace the dollar. In the early 2000s, the euro was created, and everyone wondered, will this supplant the dollar? In the 20 teens, the bitterness from an American-made global financial crisis kind of had people wondering. And now we have a new one with a new landscape with the G20 kind of fracturing, Russia sanctions, whether they've worked or not, a war still going on 2 years later, and things looking uncertain in the US. I think the two most sort of interesting examples have been with Iran when Europe considered creating an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, to continue to trade with Iran without violating US sanctions. The interesting thing was that no European country wanted to be the home for that special purpose vehicle. If that SPV didn't have a country in which to sort of reside in a jurisdiction, it couldn't exist, and no country wanted that responsibility to be the country that went against the US so markedly. And now we're seeing BRICS countries align together: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then a lot of Gulf states are coming in on that deal. A lot of African countries are considering it. The South African one of their economic policymakers was in Washington just last week, actually, and he was asked about this, and he said, "There's no paper trail of a de-dollarization effort that we're in." So there's a lot of talk, but not so much action. One example I can give is that Russia, since the invasion and those big sanctions, one reason that US-led economic sanctions on Russia did not have the impact that people expected of just like ending the war, Russia was able to convert into a war economy with the help of China and India and a couple of other countries. India has purchased a lot of Russian oil. A lot of Russian oil couldn't trade on regular markets because it's all dollar-based, and there was a sort of a curtailment there. But Russian President Vladimir Putin, turns out he had all these Indian rupees, but there's no, the exchangeability is not as strong. So he didn't know what to do with them. You can't just go out and buy things with rupees. It's like me being here in Washington and going to Target or Walmart across the street and saying, "I have rupees, I don't have dollars. Will you let me buy this in dollars?" And you're going to be told no. And so that's a little bit of a roadblock. We're also seeing Russian local companies issuing local debt in the Chinese yuan, and they're finding that the rate is volatile because the level of the yuan is in a large part set by and controlled by a government that's also not transparent. And so the interest costs are very high. And so they're running into those kinds of problems. And so we're seeing the system being tested. Each test is a chink in the armor that the US is as the world's reserve asset, but we're also seeing more talk than success.
And so, Saleha, despite these examples that you've actually cited, do you think currencies like the yuan, the euro, the Emirati dirham, or the Indian rupee do really have that, that potency to actually replace the strength of the US dollar or its viability? Why do you think that might or might not be the case?
I mean, I would just point to facts, just like I said a couple of days ago, we saw a Middle East crisis starting to erupt and people poured into the dollar. Investors are the ones who are the people who actually control money flows and decide where to park their cash, how to use money. They're going to be the ones to decide who the reserve asset is and who the owner of that asset is. If there's a crisis somewhere and people stop turning to the dollar, or if all of a sudden the US is issuing debt and people aren't as insatiably desperate and eager and excited to purchase it, then there is a little bit of a dent. But I was keenly watching. My book came out March 19th, and I've been doing a lot of these talks. And I was saying that next time there's a crisis, it could be a regional crisis. When there's instability in Venezuela or in the Middle East or in Asia somewhere, a regional banking crisis, then people come to the dollar. And we saw that happen with Iran and Israel. We saw the dollar become even stronger, because of higher interest rates. The dollar has been strong for the last couple of months and longer. But all of a sudden, it was even stronger because there was more demand for it. Why was there more demand? Because there was volatility somewhere in the world.
And Saleha, now speaking about, non-US financial planners and, speaking about their fears about the factors associated with the US economy itself, what do you really think should be those factors that might be keeping them worried about the viability and the strength of the US dollar itself?
I think it's the US. It's looking at the domestic state of the US. A lot of people talk about all these different threats to US power globally and the dollar's power and centrality globally. No foreign threat can supplant the dollar or damage the dollar enough to actually change the trajectory of it, especially in the same way as domestic threats could. I think as long as the US remains a stable democracy with rule of law, with free and fair elections ourselves, with institutions, public institutions like the Federal Reserve and the courts that are trusted and remain sort of like this sanctuary in the world, then the dollar and the US will remain to have that credit and faith of the world, because any autocracy that is trying to consolidate power through a reserve asset or through a mechanism that allows people to trade outside of the dollar, the minute that that autocracy has a change in power, which ultimately happens because the curtain closes on everyone's lives, then there is going to be a power grab, a power vacuum. There's going to be instability there. And investors, because it's more opaque and it's not an open, free election everywhere, then investors aren't going to be able to predict what could happen. Whereas in the US, if as long as whatever the US is internally going on, dealing with right now in terms of our electorate being unhappy and partisan divides, as long as we can kind of recover from this, and 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people know we will still have free and fair elections, I think investors will continue to see the US as the most stable economy and investment that they could have. But the thing is that the US is posing a lot of challenges to this itself, a lot of self-inflicted wounds. A couple of bruises that I can point out is debt ceiling fights, a federal shutdown. All of these things shake the confidence of investors and foreign countries in the US's ability to continue to lead. Also, just the deep divisions in the country, all this partisanship where we can't even agree on the color of the sky. Is global warming real? Like, everyone has different set of facts that they're coming at. And that is not good for democracy. And one key reason, I would say the biggest threat to the dollar, is actually our deficit, and not even the deficit as it stands right now. Because right now, the Treasury Department keeps issuing treasuries and people keep buying them. The interest rate cost on that is as low as it could be for the kind of debt profile that the US has. No one else can kind of pull that off the way the US does, because we are the world's reserve asset. But if unless we have bipartisanship and lawmakers can work together and the country can come together, there's no way that the government can make the tough decisions that will be necessary to bring down the deficit. And so that's sort of the key. You know, the second line in my book, in Paper Soldiers, is all empires think they're special and all empires fall. And many empires, I'm not saying America is an empire in the traditional historic sense, but it's a superpower. Many superpowers have fallen, and credit and debt has been the beginning of their demise.
So, Saleha, before we wrap up our conversation, my last question, and this is again about the topic that we're sort of like touching on, and this is about the question of de-dollarization itself. What do you think can perhaps the US and the other peer great powers or major powers can really do to sort of create a win-win for the each side, and to sort of reduce that push in that direction? What could that really look like?
I think, one, the US just needs to emerge from this very self-critical moment in its democracy stronger, or just strong. But I think I'll go back to multilateralism. I think countries sort of working together. I talk about Bretton Woods, this conference in the 1940s that kind of brought countries together. That's why we have the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, that countries are so economically integrated that we can't hurt the other without causing a self-inflicted wound, right? So the US led sanctions on Russia, but gas prices in the US were affected by that. Americans paid more at the gas pump for a little while, right? So that's the how deeply integrated. So as long as we stay integrated, stay in dialogue, and try to make as many efforts multilateral as possible, I think then the strength of the current global order, which is built around the dollar, will remain.
Saleha, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. Our team works very hard to make this work possible. And it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.